If you're visiting us for the first time or you're new to the congregation, my remarks will be about something that the congregation has been going through, and they're kind of in-house. Today, they are about developmental ministry, which the congregation has chosen to pursue for the past, well, about 2 years ago. And I encourage you to come back. This service, this message will not be probably spiritually inspiring, but I need to inform the congregation more about what developmental ministry is like. So I just want you to know those things, and I welcome you to come back for one of our more regular services. This one will be about information. Long ago, when I was in my 20s, I went through a difficult time and I went to a counselor. I was still holding a job at an urban planning agency in Tennessee and went to the local Unitarian Universalist church regularly and had contacts with friends. I just needed help with some issues from a difficult childhood. Later, I decided to pursue the Unitarian Universalist ministry, and I earned a Master of Divinity degree from a Unitarian Universalist seminary in Chicago, Meadville Lombard Theological School, and entered the Unitarian ministry. In 2005, I became an accredited interim minister after 3 years of training and supervision. 12 years after that, I earned a Master of Science degree in pastoral clinical mental health counseling from Newman University. Throughout my career as a Unitarian Universalist minister, I have focused most of my energy on interim ministry, helping congregations prepare for a settled minister. I share this with you today because I believe that sometimes we need help, and sometimes we need to give help. That is true of us as individuals and as a community. Sometimes a church needs help. Sometimes there are things from the past or ongoing behaviors that are part of the church's life that need to be dealt with. A congregation is like and unlike a family. And like a family, things can be passed from generation to generation. Most of these traits and behaviors are good. Congregations like this one have been involved in social justice for a long time. Before most of us ever heard of Unitarian Universalism, there was a church in the Lehigh Valley that stood up for a just society and welcomed theological diversity. This congregation is the heir to that legacy passed down from a group of people who met in this area shortly after the Second World War, seeking a religious community free from creed and dogma. In that journey, the congregation became a fellowship, which is what we called a Unitarian Universalist congregation that did not have a minister in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. Eventually, more fellow members joined the fellowship, and it became clear to many that a minister was needed, and Howard Lynn was called as your first minister. Something you need to know about this fellowship movement is that 80% of the Unitarian Universalist congregations founded as fellowships from the 1940s to the 1970s have disbanded. Your congregation is a survivor, and I give you congratulations for your persistence. It took a lot. Your congregation grew and thrived. The Developmental Task Force recently held a meeting to talk about the ministry of the congregation in November, and we reviewed the history of the congregation as living members remembered it. It was observed that there were difficult times when conflict existed. It was noted by some that ministers usually had brief tenures with the congregations at times, I might add, often at a time when ministerial tenures were longer than they are now. Something was happening back then, and even more recently. When I was your contract minister, the first year that I served this congregation, the congregation decided to hire a developmental minister to help them with a chronic issue. The developmental task, as named, is to commence a long-term assessment of the congregation's ability to connect and value each other in kindness, as well as our ability to live our covenant more fully. There were other goals set by the congregation at the same time. None of the others dealt with developmental ministry, though. Developmental ministry is about chronic issues that a congregation has been dealing with for a long time. The other goals were not relevant to developmental ministry because they were not issues that the congregation had for a long time. So, what is developmental ministry about? Developmental ministry is about examining a chronic issue faced by a congregation and working on it. Chronic, in this case, means that the issue being worked on has been recurring over the life of the congregation, or at least a large part of it. The developmental ministry process is intentionally slow for that reason. Issues that have existed over a long time period cannot be resolved quickly. Congregations need time to turn from one behavior to another, or time to resolve something that has been present in congregational life for a long time. By their nature, issues that have persisted in the life of a family or church cannot usually be resolved without a bit of time given to the matter. Therefore, developmental ministry is intended to be for a period of 4 to 7 years. Some in the congregation have told leadership that I have been with you for 2.5 years and things in developmental ministry have not been moving quickly. Actually, I have only been your developmental minister for only about 1.5 years. The first year that I was with you, I was your contract minister. So what does it take to be a developmental minister? What background does a developmental minister need? Usually developmental ministers are either those who have done similar work in ministry or have been accredited interim ministers. Accredited interim ministers have been certified by the Unitarian Universalist Transitional Ministers Chapter after 1 year of training, completing a paper on an issue related to interim ministry, and 3 successful years of supervised interim ministry. Currently, I am the accredited interim minister who has had that status longest and is currently serving in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. So I've had quite a lot of experience with developmental transitional ministry. I received certification in transitional ministry, accredited interim ministry in 2005. Each congregation presents different issues with different hoped for outcomes. With interim ministry, there are 5 tasks to be accomplished during a 2-year period. In developmental ministry, the congregation names its own tasks, and the congregation works with the developmental minister to accomplish them. I think that developmental ministry is usually kind of like mental health counseling. It's with the developmental minister taking on the role of helping a congregation help itself. This is my bias, though, as I have a graduate degree in mental health counseling. Most of the reasons that congregations have chronic issues derive from relational issues. This seems like a false analogy because there is the assumption that counselors only work with people who have diagnosable mental illnesses. That assumption does not apply to many counselors, but there does apply to many counselors, but there are also counselors who work with couples or families on their issues. There are counselors who work with individuals or families about changing a behavior or making a big decision. Some counselors facilitate an environment where change can occur in many ways, even those that do not include mental illness. Behaviors in a church are akin to a large family. In fact, ministers in many seminaries are taught Bowen's family systems theory, a form of family therapy as a means of understanding congregational dynamics. Family systems theory is used by clergy from many different religious traditions. It basically says that behaviors in a family or institution are formed in response to a situation, and they are conveyed from generation to generation. The work of family systems theory is to understand the cause of the behavior that is passed down and to find ways to change it. Developmental ministry takes time to accomplish its work and requires patience. Until our November gathering about the congregation's ministry, I could not understand what happened in this church that led to your developmental task. You seemed kind. You seemed to be getting along very well. I was unaware that the past still evokes strong emotions from some of you. No one told me what had happened, nor that so much was left unresolved. I think it was a learning for all of us who attended. I did not expect people to have strong emotions about things that happened 20 years ago. That was surprising. The work of developmental ministry is the congregation's work. The developmental minister with the developmental ministry task force facilitates that process, but it is the congregation's work. Another realization that occurred to me from the November meeting is that the congregation has a history of mostly short ministries with ministers. Upon reflecting on your history, I came to the conclusion that if you want to minister, then you will need to understand vocational ministry better. This congregation began in the 1940s, and your first minister was called in the 1960s or 70s, I believe. You went from being a fellowship to being a church in our Unitarian Universalist lingo. The first 20 years that this congregation existed, it did so without a minister. It had a fellowship culture. In those days, when a fellowship wanted to call a minister, someone was sent to explain the expectations that came with a minister, like salary, housing allowance, insurance, office space, and so on. These were important logistical learnings for the congregation. What was missing in those days was the change that a minister might bring to an institution that was unaccustomed to working with one. Some of the congregations that began as fellowships still have difficulty working with ministers, even after 50 or 60 years or more of working with ministers. Another developmental task might be about working better with ministers. I think that that would be a help for you. Let me share with you this morning that your congregation's issues are real, but your problems do not seem to be so deep they cannot be faced. And they are not soul-wrenching as some of the problems I have encountered in other congregations. I have served congregations that had much deeper issues than yours. After serving an interim ministry in one church, I spoke with a minister who followed me. She told me that the problem in that congregation was that they hated each other. That's her words. I am sad to agree. I have served a church divided by social class. I have served a church divided by race, though the white people did not acknowledge that division and the people of color remained silent. Your congregation is not like those congregations. You have issues, but they are things that can be dealt with. And I don't believe that there's a hostility amongst you. Some of the problems you have are the results of ministers who misconducted. For all that, at the core of this congregation is something important. You care for each other. When a member is in need, you reach out. When someone is ill, you connect. When someone needs a ride, you, you find someone to give someone a ride. When someone is sad or lonely, you make every effort to drop a line or make a call. I cannot recall in the 19 other congregations I have served, worked for, or been a member of, people more dedicated to caring for each other. No congregation is perfect, but you do care for each other. This morning, it is to be acknowledged that caring for each other, even during difficult times, takes commitment to this spiritual community. Those of you who have been in this congregation for a long time know that love is hard in the long haul. You have had the love of this faith community stay with it through conflicts, ministers, and changes. Members of this congregation also acknowledge that there are good times too. You have stood for social justice in the Lehigh Valley and the larger community. You have reared children in this congregation. You have made close, enduring friendships. You have lent your voices and talents to make music together. You have been a place of connection in hard times. In closing, I want to tell you I like you. I have told you that before. I think you are in a time of change and perhaps changing identity. This happens with congregations. Things change, and the congregation has to acknowledge the changes and sometimes to change itself to fit its new reality. Sometimes there is an understandable tendency to dwell on what is lost rather than to recognize the opportunity that the future holds. Your best days for this congregation can be ahead of you rather than behind you. With change also often comes possibility. I want you to embrace that possibility. The Lehigh Valley needs a Unitarian Universalist congregation to speak to these times and stand for our religious values of affirming diversity, ending oppression, engaging with democracy, and creating a beloved community. There has never been a moment in all of our lifetimes when Unitarian Universalism was needed more than it is now. As we engage in developmental ministry to strengthen this congregation, we will continue to speak and to act. We will also continue to support one another. For the members of the Developmental Ministry Task Force, Maggie Brown, Jean Davis, Cecilia Eberhardt, and Tom Van Doren, may we be grateful. For this congregation and its ministry to its members and to the world, may we be truly grateful as well. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.